You're listening to WPKN 89.5 FM in Bridgeport and streaming online at WPKN.org.
Reporting and supporting what matters. This is CT Examiner Weekly.
The U.S. Department of Energy admitted to a federal court that it cut grants to states that voted for Kamala Harris in 2024. What does that mean for Connecticut residents who already pay some of the highest electricity bills in the country? I'm reporter Jacques Abou-Rizk in Washington with the story.
It's been 3 years since a family in Old Lyme notified state and local officials of high levels of benzene and xylene in their well water. 3 years later, they called CT Examiner for help, claiming nothing's been done. I'm reporter LeMaster with that story.
2 primary elections, 2 very different results for longtime incumbents. I'm reporter Luke Feeney with more on Connecticut's primary elections.
Heading into the last days of summer with beehives, spooky movies, and antique auto racing, I'm Robin Breeding with the CT Examiner Arts Calendar.
And I'm Editor-in-Chief Gregory Stroud. It's great to have you all in the studio. Let's start the roundtable. Before we dig into the stories, Luke, is there a word to describe what you saw last night at the watch parties? You were at, I think, 3 different parties for primary elections. What did you hear? What sums it up?
I would say focus. I think it was a long campaign, and certainly there was a lot of back and forth, and no one wants to lose a political race, right? But I think once the results were announced, I was surprised by how quickly the losers came together and said, we need to unite and try and win in November.
So it was a coming together then. It wasn't, you didn't have that divisive feeling.
Yeah. And I do think while some people, I'm sure the losers of last night's elections would say they should have won, but I think the focus was November.
But if there were primaries in Connecticut, no doubt all eyes this fall are in Washington. And Jacques, you are reporting for us from Washington, and you've got a big story about how politics in a big political fight is playing out in Connecticut and for Connecticut ratepayers. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Just recently, the U.S. Department of Energy agreed that they canceled federal grants meant for energy research based solely on whether a state had voted for Kamala Harris in 2024. Connecticut ended up losing $52.9 million in grant funding, and that has just added to the struggles that Connecticut has had in bringing down energy prices in the state.
So, I mean, this was a pretty breathtaking admission in a federal court. The Trump administration said it was just politics. It was payback, and that payback is affecting and I think from your reporting, it's not just green energy, it's not just offshore wind, it's not just solar, but it was a broad range of projects. Is that right, Chuck?
It is, yes. I mean, Connecticut for a long time has understood that we need to look at all forms of energy generation to meet this moment. And what we're seeing is just delays on all fronts, whether it's natural gas, whether it's wind energy, or whether it's solar. And so really when we see these actions from the Trump administration, the question is whether or not there's something that we can do to actually bring down these energy prices. What is the solution?
One of the big projects was at the University of Connecticut. And that project is still on hold as far as I understand.
It is, yes. UConn actually lost a grant totaling $2.25 million. And that grant was meant to fund research that would have helped develop an AI system that could provide better grid resiliency in strong weathers and weather events. And so without that funding, that project has been on hold. The university is appealing the decision, but it's unclear whether and when that funding will be restored.
I mean, part of your story is that it's not just some of the delays, some of the problems, some of the difficulty bringing new sources of energy aboard they don't just come down to a fight between the Trump administration and Democrats in Connecticut. This has been a longer running problem for Connecticut.
It has, and we see that with Revolution Wind. We see that with the Constitution Pipeline. These projects have faced delays, not just because of the Trump administration, but because of issues between states and internally in Connecticut as well. The Constitution Pipeline has been in a battle for over a decade as to whether or not the states can agree that to build this pipeline, to expand this pipeline and better support the energy demands of New England.
So just to be clear, the Constitution Pipeline, that would bring natural gas from Pennsylvania across New York, right to the border of Connecticut, potentially bringing more. It's a carbon-based fuel, so it's controversial in blue states, but energy and electricity in part is still a lot of it's generated with natural gas. So to keep prices down, there's some question about, do we need some kind of bridge? Or I think in your story, it was this all of the above strategy.
For so long, there's been this understanding, especially on the Republican side, that we need to embrace an all of the above strategy when it comes to energy. And that means not just looking at renewable energies, not just looking at natural gas or fossil fuels, but looking at how we can combine these energy forms to get the best use of our taxpayer dollar.
Jacques, if I understand, is there some kind of pushback about groundwater contamination with the pipeline?
There is, and that's been the major issue. New York has rejected that project, that Constitution Pipeline project, because they claim that it would damage local water resources. And that's been the real big holdup with the Constitution Pipeline right now.
So I was wondering if you got a sort of sense of how common it was for a presidential administration to cancel grants based on politics and which states voted for when you were doing the story.
It's completely unprecedented, especially for the federal administration to sort of just blatantly admit that these grants were canceled for political reasons. It's very unprecedented, and the experts I talked to couldn't come up with a previous example of something so blatantly political.
So certainly what I know is that in this coming governor's race, energy and maybe the ability to work with the federal government or work against it is going to be one of the big topics, because right now we have a race between Democrats and Republicans, between Ryan Fazio and Ned Lamont, and we'll see if they agree on this or not.
To that point, Greg, Fazio has campaigned hard on electric prices. I'm wondering, Jacques, what does these canceled grants, how does that impact the state's electric grid? Did anyone speak to that?
I think it does have an impact, because when we cancel grants for research regarding a wide range of projects, then in turn, we're taking away from companies that are investing in these projects. We see this sort of hesitation from companies that will likely come up in the future, that they won't support these projects because there's an uncertainty of whether they will be able to be completed and not canceled. So I think it sets a precedent that it's maybe unclear whether companies can support renewable energy and get a return on their investment.
So that was great reporting, Jacques. I think your reporting shows just how important it is for Connecticut news to have someone in Washington, someone talking to our leaders there, someone talking to the agencies. And I really appreciate that. And it really brings us to our next story in a way. This idea of the pipeline of groundwater, of potential hydrocarbons leaking into the water, but we have it on a hyper-local level, Allie. And so what have you been reporting on?
So there is this residential home in Old Lyme, which they have been doing some construction and have tested high for xylene and benzene in their water. And they are directly across from a former gas station. And they have concerns that maybe some of these underground tanks weren't taken out and that they're potentially leaking into their water.
So, Allie, you've been to the property.
Yes.
When you talk about pollution, when you talk about something in the water, How did you experience it yourself?
Right. So I had, they showed me around their property. We went to the well. You could see on the well, there was a film on top of the water. And then they pulled some of the water out, and I smelled some of the water, and it smelled strongly of gasoline. It smelled like pure gasoline.
And in this case, benzene, xylene, these are solvents. They've been used, industrial solvents. We know that benzene, which was also used in dry cleaning, is a known significant carcinogen. So this is something that causes cancer in humans and other animals. Xylene, less so, a related sort of slightly safer chemical solvent, but again, something you don't want in your water. And so when you find this in your water, what do? What did they do? Did they do the right thing?
So they notified DEEP. So this happened about 3 years ago in December of 2023. They did all their testing about the water while they were doing construction. They notified DEEP, and I believe they notified people of the town. And so far, nothing has been done to remediate their situation.
What's the next step? What are they trying to do now? One thing is they reached out to us.
Right. Within the past 3 years that this has happened, there is a new regulation that sites, once they are notified that they present a contaminant to the environment, that they, within 72 hours, if they were contacted within 72 hours, then the state has to come in and fix that. So we'll see how this plays out. I think there's a lot of questions over, who's going to pay for this to remediate some of these plumes. It's highly expensive. And from my understanding, the current site, the owner of the current site had it as a service station, not as a gas station. So he potentially bought it with these tanks underground.
Ali, is this just local to Old Lyme, or is this something happening throughout the state?
So I spoke to someone from Save the Sound, and they were saying that there's a lot of these plumes, that, the state kind of has to grapple with it because they get so many notices of them. But again, these are expensive. They take a lot of time and resources to remediate it, and they can be kind of complex and illegal in a legal regard.
So it seems like people are ducking this, though, even though the owners are asking for help. Everybody locally and, deep agency-wise seems to be ducking. Do you understand that?
I think it's fair to say that there's some ducking going on here. It seems like they've reached out to certain staff members from the town of Old Lyme, and they haven't really been able to find records of tanks being taken out of the ground. And they said that essentially DEEP hasn't been communicating with them.
In this case, as far as DEEP is concerned, these homeowners, the ones that came to them complaining about pollution in their wells, they're the ones currently that are responsible or to blame as far as the state agency is concerned. Is that right?
Right. They essentially received a letter stating that much to that point. I think another thing I also want to mention is the fact that, this land is next to a marsh. And from this property, you can see the marsh leading on to the Long Island Sound. So it's a question of, how big is this plume? They can be really difficult to understand, how big they are, how much is in there, and is it leaking potentially into the Long Island Sound?
Is anybody locally, like, say, the Gateway Commission or the local environmental agency, the Wetlands Commission, have they been involved at all?
I haven't checked in with them. I know that we've reached out to Ledge Light, and we have asked them about it. We haven't heard back. We've asked to the first select woman of Old Lyme if she's heard anything. She said, when we contacted her, that was the first time we're hearing about it. We do know that the fire marshal has been aware of the testing results.
I remember it was now about 3 years ago, there was an oil leak. And these are pretty common. There was an oil leak, and it came from an old tank. And a valve was stuck, and it poured hundreds of gallons of diesel fuel. Actually, in that case, it wasn't oil, diesel fuel into the ground. And, we found out about this. We forced some scrutiny. They did testing, and they said, no, we found pollution, but it was from an old leak. This is a plume from another leak. And what we discovered was that there were all kinds of leaks just on Lime Street, a historic district, a relatively rural town. And you can imagine what it's like in Bridgeport or in Groton or in another town in Killingly. And it's not just xylene or benzene, but as you've been reporting on, Allie, it's PFAs or it is, beryllium in the water in East Lyme. And so it comes down to, it's a huge problem. Are we putting enough resources into solving it? And the test right now is that it takes a news reporter and 3 years before a state agency is willing to get involved in a case that's bigger than most people would be comfortable with.
Yeah, I'm sure the homeowners are obviously don't feel like enough's being done. But there is a new regulation that started in March to help with this issue.
So this is certainly, in a state of wells, in a state that's debating sewers and installing more sewers, the water and the groundwater is just something that we'll come back to again and again and again. Whether a few years ago it was pulling water, fearing corporations pulling water out of the aquifer and selling it elsewhere, whether it's groundwater intrusion, saltwater intrusion on the shoreline, whether it's PFAs. Has anyone tested PFAs at the wells for local schools? We don't know the answer. And so I'm sure we'll be back to you again and again for this, Allie. Our last story, Luke, is politics. And, I feel the politics in the air. It's the end of summer. The elections will be on us in no time. And so what happened last night?
So something pretty historic in a state where incumbents usually don't face primary challenges. Two did. Congressman John Larson from the 1st District, he faced a primary from 3 challengers, former Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin, State Rep Jillian Gilchrist, and Hartford-based attorney Ruth Fortune. And Governor Ned Lamont faced a primary from State Rep Josh Elliott. And this is the first time a governor in Connecticut has faced one in nearly 50 years.
So were these primaries, is this young versus old? Is this progressive versus moderate or conservative? Is this what are the stakes here?
I want to start with Larson's race because I think that race to me was fascinating because we've seen around the country older Democrats facing hard primary challenges from younger candidates. And usually those challenges have come from the left. What I found so fascinating about Larson's race was throughout the entire time, he really tried to ping himself as the most progressive candidate in the field. And it was his opponents who weren't with him.
For my take, it was a media-savvy challenger, particularly Luke Bronin, well-funded, ubiquitous for the last months, versus Larson, who I can't tell you a single TV appearance, a single bit of outreach. It's what I was hearing from local DTCs. They said, where's Larson?
Yeah, it's a stark contrast, and I think Bronin really tried to drive that in. Bronin really centered his campaign around the need for what he called a new Democratic Party, a new kind of energy, he said, to fight what he described as undemocratic actions by the Trump administration.
So some of it's just who is the better fighter, who can face off with what's happening in Washington better?
I think to that extent. And I also think all 3 of his challengers campaigned on the need to pass the torch to the next generation. And I think Bronin of the 3 probably had the best combination of being able to make the argument due to his youth, having the money to actually compete with Larson, and like you said, having the media savvy to do all these spots and, get his name out there.
For me, what's amazing is that Connecticut, with its 2 oldest incumbents, and that's Rosa DeLauro and John Larson. I mean, Rosa DeLauro was head of appropriations, could be returning to that role. Larson was he number 2 on?
He was the ranking member on the Social Security subcommittee, and that was a big part of his argument as well, that, if I win and Democrats get the House, you'll not only have the most progressive candidate, but you'll have someone in charge of dispensing millions of dollars to Americans.
A committee that has a lot of power for older Americans, a lot of older people and older voters in Connecticut. And also what I was going to say was the House Ways and Means Committee, which these are powerful. These aren't just any representatives. These are powerful representatives, and it barely gets a mention. And it's almost, younger people, I'm not sure they care. It's even fairly savvy voters. Things have changed.
And what you're describing is one of the sort of classic arguments for incumbency, that if you stay in long enough and you build up and you get enough seniority, you can find yourself as a head of one of these really powerful committees and be responsible for shaping major policy.
Yeah, and bringing home the bacon.
Exactly.
It's interesting to me that there's sort of this flip side with the Lamont campaign, where maybe it seems like people wanted to keep some continuity at this time, and the young upstart didn't win in that case.
And that race was a lot closer to sort of some of the more traditional primaries we've seen Democrats facing this year. What was surprising was just how soundly Lamont won. I mean, the race was called by 8:20 and polls closed at 8. And I think what benefited Lamont was he didn't shy away from being a progressive, but still tried to portray himself as a sensible spender who can also, has this record on progressive causes.
So heading into the fall then, what do you make of this race between Fazio and Lamont? And do you have a flavor of how it's going to play out?
I think Ryan Fazio has an uphill battle. Elliott campaigned hard against Lamont's connections to Greenwich and wealth. That is something Fazio can't really do because he grew up there. Elliott really tried to hammer Lamont because he argued he wasn't strong enough to stand up to Trump and he wasn't doing enough. Fazio admitted he voted for Trump 3 times. I think given the voter makeup of this state, I think Fazio will have an uphill battle.
So Jacques, you were talking to Fazio just a couple of days ago and about energy policy. Do you have a sense of is there a tough point or a tough question that Fazio can put to Lamont in this fall election?
I think what we've seen across the country, and especially in Connecticut, is this idea that affordability is on the top of mind for most Americans. And with affordability comes electricity prices. How are both of these candidates saying that they will reduce electricity and energy prices in Connecticut? And what Fazio told me when we spoke just a couple days ago is this idea that he embraces this all of the above approach. He agrees that we should be investing in renewable energy, but at the same time, we need to look at whether fossil fuels, whether natural gas can also provide us some relief. And so he didn't really decide to take one side more than the other. Rather, he chose for a pragmatic approach. And what we've seen from Governor Lamont is more maybe wishy-washy approach to energy, where sometimes he's tentatively supported the Constitution pipeline and natural gas, but then we see some struggles with Connecticut really being able to implement some of those plans. So I think the question of how does Governor Lamont plan to bring down energy prices is a question that most Connecticut residents are asking, and I think Fazio will be asking of the governor come the fall.
We do know that a lot of voters across the spectrum aren't very happy right now. And some of it, no doubt in Connecticut, is a blue state, is Donald Trump. But it's not just Donald Trump. And that's part of the story of these primaries. So that was great reporting, Luke. And we'll be back to this again and again as we come into the fall elections.
Looking forward to it.
But that's not all we do at CT Examiner. We also have, I think, some of the best arts and culture reporting in the state, and we certainly have the best calendar of events in the state, and that is curated by our arts editor, Robin Breeding. And so, Robin, what events do you have for us this week?
We're starting to come into the end of the season, and I love some outdoor events because kids are going to be going back to school before they know it. And first up, I have all the month of August in Constitution Plaza in Hartford. They have outdoor movies, and it's a horror festival. And so you can come bring your blanket and popcorn and everything. And August 22nd, The Mouth of Madness. August 29th, The Exorcist. And September 5th, The Others. So you can get out there and have fun.
Saturday evenings through August. So what else do you have for us?
All right, heading into the harvest time of year, we have Bartlett Arboretum and Gardens in Stamford, and they always have a great honey harvest festival every year. And that's coming up on Sunday, August 30th at 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., and it's free.
So Bartlett Arboretum is sort of one of the gems of Stamford. I know it's beloved. It comes up in our coverage quite a bit, protecting it, building it, and honey harvest festival.
Yeah, so they'll have actually beekeepers, they'll have classes, they'll have tastings, all kinds of things.
August 30th at the Bartlett Arboretum in Stamford. Okay,
so there is the Surfside Hotel is having a huge angler competition for bluefish, and you can go to bluefishtournament.com. You can actually win a lot of prize money, and anyone on Long Island Sound can go and compete for the biggest fish. So bluefishtournament.com. All right. So at the New Britain Museum of American Art, there is a new show that's just opened, which is dear to my heart. It's Louise Nevelson and Esther Slobodkina. And so these are two people who were artists in the 50s, very active, came over as emigres from Russia in the 20s, and both use construction and,
They're probably, to tell you the truth, I'd say Louise Nevelson might be the most influential, least known.
And this is a big show. And these two women have never been, they work together in New York, and they've never shown together. They've never put their work together, and they have a lot of overlap. It's a big show, and I think it's well worth going from anywhere in the state.
I know the New Britain Museum of American Art, it outpunches its weight. I mean, this is a good museum.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I've been there multiple times, and every time I go, I'm just I'm blown away by some of the stuff they have there.
So Louise Nevelson, Esther Slobodkina, and that is the New Britain Museum of Art.
Through November 1st.
And what else do you have for us?
All right, last up is Sunday in the Park. It's a historic festival of automobiles that are racing, and this year it's Alfa Romeos are the focus at the historic Lime Rock Park in Lakeville, Connecticut.
So far northwestern corner of the state, a historic, it's the third oldest racetrack car racing track in America. A beautiful setting. They have classic racing, classic events, beautiful town, not very far from Litchfield and all the kind of events in Litchfield, great restaurants, pretty close to Great Barrington, which might have the greatest cheese shop in America. So wedge between a racetrack, wedge between cheese and Litchfield and all that Litchfield has to offer. So certainly that sounds, and when is that?
That's September 4th through September 7th. At Lime Rock Park in Lakeville, Connecticut.
It might be one of the prettiest places that you've never been to in Connecticut. I certainly recommend you go.
So that's what we've got going on coming up. I hope you all get out and have fun.
But before we go, I'd like to ask all the staff, what do you think the big story was this week? What got the most reads? What got the most attention on social media? Allie?
I know we said flock cameras last week, but I feel like it's probably flock cameras again. People are very upset about this.
I'm going to say Jacques' story. I think it hits on a lot of important issues. As we mentioned, the state isn't necessarily crazy about the president. So I think finding out that millions of dollars were canceled in grants for mostly political reasons, I think people will be interested in that.
It was Jacques' story. It was energy, and how it plays out with consumers and the environment. That was the story. That was the connection and what's happening in Washington. And thank you, Jacques, for bringing that to us here in Connecticut. That's about it for this week's episode of CT Examiner Weekly. And we will be back next week, as always, because the news is never done.
For more news and events, or if you want to send in comments or story ideas, please go to ctexaminer.com. And if you want to support our mission of keeping Connecticut informed of the news that matters, a subscription is just $20 for the entire year. reporting and supporting what matters. This has been CT Examiner Weekly. Thanks for listening.